open as you'd like to be. Thank you. Just as an aside, so we are the local host here in Calgary for the Organization for the Study of Sex Differences International Meeting, May 7th to 11th at the Hyatt Hotel downtown. I'm the president-elect and also the local host, and would love, love, love for everybody in the audience, and please pass this on, to submit your proposal. It is for scientific symposia as well as individual talks. Across the spectrum, it says the Organization of the Study of Sex Differences, but it does include gender as well. So please submit those. If you are a trainee or have trainees, abstracts will be, that will open in February. And it's a great opportunity with travel awards, even though we live in Calgary, to present your work to an international audience. So without further ado, I am truly delighted to welcome our guest speaker today, Dr. Rebecca Sullivan, and I'm going to look down at my piece of paper, but just to make sure that I can succinctly outline all of Dr. Sullivan's multiple accolades and accomplishments. So she is a professor in the Faculty of Arts and the past president of the Sexuality Studies Association, as well as the Canadian Communications Association. She is also a senior mentor at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Institute of Gender and Health. And so certainly her work it is cross-disciplinary, as you can see. She is the author and editor of 8 books, specifically including 4 health research interests, Biotechnology in Canada, which was the winner of the Gertrude J. Robinson Prize for Best Book in Canadian Communication, and Pornography, Structures, Agency, and Performance. So I will pass the mic to Dr. Sullivan and move out of the way. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to try and stand, sort of, we found my little performance box. Great. If anyone on Zoom, if you're having difficulty hearing or seeing, just let us know in chat and I will adjust accordingly. I want to thank everyone, especially Sophia, my compadre in IGH, but also Lauren and Aaron and everyone involved in this seminar series. I think it's a really important and timely opportunity for us to reflect on how are we doing research. So I want to start with a little anecdote. I was working on this. I'd already decided, you know what, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to talk about how we do methodology in gender and sexuality studies. And then this week, I was cited in a prestigious medical journal. So I should be pleased, right? I mean, science, come on, I'm validated. Except I was so grossly misrepresented. It just blew my mind. And it couldn't be excused as a misunderstanding. It was just an ethical violation. And it can't be excused by the idea that, well, it wasn't a peer-refereed article, it was a letter to the editor. I'm like, you need to at least meet the standards of the Globe and Mail. You know? But it got me thinking about why we get mad in gender and sexuality studies. And we get mad, frankly, because we are dismissed. We are referred to as a throwback, an unnecessary accoutrement to the university. Haven't we solved the problem now? Don't we have feminist queer researchers in every discipline? And isn't that good enough? And the reason why it's not good enough is because when you are beholden to the discipline, it is the disciplinary methodologies, the disciplinary theoretical framework, the disciplinary ethics that take priority. And gender and sexuality becomes a nice to have, not a need to have. In gender and sexuality studies, the gender and sexual lens is all that matters. And nothing less than people's lives are at stake. So I just want to, how do I change? Did you want to change?
I can do this.
No, I would prefer to.
So just that.
Yes, sorry, I apologize to everyone in the audience. I'd heard you say you were going to stand there and I suddenly realized you were. Like I saw you there, but I hadn't quite clicked that you weren't phoned. Okay, so what can I tell you about the Gender and Sexuality Studies program? We just changed our name about a year, 2 years ago from Women's Studies. And that in of itself was a bit of a tussle. We've tried to do this multiple times over the 20+ years that I've been at the University of Calgary. And rather frustratingly, individuals who have no affiliation with the program, can't teach in it, can't supervise students in it, will step up and go, no, women's studies matters. And I said, does it matter enough for you to teach the core intro course? No. Okay, yeah. So we finally got it through. It is an interdisciplinary, non-departmentalized program. I think this really matters. It's worth pointing out. On the one hand, it's like, oh, wow, you're super cool, cutting edge. We don't have a budget. We don't have a seat at the table. What we try and do is bring that gender and sexuality lens. A gender and sexuality lens in 2022 must be intersectional, must be decolonial, but it looks at the experiences of people marginalized for their gender and sexuality. It says, how will this policy affect the people marginalized for their gender and sexuality? How does this theory resonate for the people marginalized because of their gender and sexuality? Does this methodology address directly, inform and empower people marginalized for their gender and sexuality? Or are we speaking over them and down to them? And too often, it's the latter. We offer a number of health-related courses. And today I want to talk about our methods course, which I've been teaching for too long. And it's in fact it's my favorite course to teach. It's not the students' favorite. I think by the end of it, it is the students' favorite. But I think especially in the arts, students are afraid of methods. I think we make methods unsafe. We make them difficult to understand. We obfuscate because we don't want people checking our work. We play the math is hard card in quantitative studies. We play the, well, we're just, trying to find our way in qualitative studies. And we play the educated guessing game in interpretive studies. Well, again, I can't say this enough. People's lives are at stake in gender and sexuality studies. So we have to be rigorous and thorough and transparent and accountable. And so it often frustrates us. It makes us mad when we're told we're flaky and hippie and social justice-y and running a political ideology and not doing real research. Strong interdisciplinary research comes from strong disciplinary roots. Have you all heard that? I've heard that so many times. I'm like, I am unfaithful to the disciplines because people's lives are at stake. So we tend to do mixed methodologies. And mixed methodologies gets a bit of a bad rap, as well it should, if it's not done systematically and rigorously. So we have to do a lot of front loading in gender and sexuality studies. By that I mean, before we begin to do the research, we have to think through all the different ways it could go horribly wrong. It could get picked apart and dismantled. You know, I tell my students, we have to be so aware, because the world doesn't want to hear what we have to say. If the world wanted to hear what we have to say, we wouldn't be fighting gender and sexual inequity. If the world wanted to hear what we have to say, the headlines wouldn't be filled with Hockey Canada, RCMP, Canadian military, policing, social work, and so on. Because we have actually come up with some pretty good arguments, solutions, data, but we just have to keep saying it over and over again. So why do we do mixed methodologies? Well, first off, we need the quantitative. We need some generalizable data. We need to say, yes, there is so a health gap. Yes, there is so higher rates of maternal mortality in Canada than we care to actually report. Headline from this past week. Yes, there is so systemic health inequities in lower income and immigrant and BIPOC communities. Yes, trans youth are at higher risk. So we need the data. But we need testimony as well. We need to also be able to say, and these are the consequences. These are the lived realities of people at risk. They are empowered subjects. They can speak for themselves and they can tell you what's wrong and what they need. That doesn't mean that we just take what they say at face value. We're scholars, we bring analysis. We have the data, which they don't have. They might ask for something which we know has been tried and didn't work, and then we can pick away. It's like, well, what did we miss? Or why do you think this is the solution? But we need both. And we need what we call the hermeneutic or the interpretive data. And we need that because we are ultimately, all research is telling a story. I'll give a little example there because that's always the area that gets abandoned. I was, and still am, part of the an entrepreneurial scholarship framework here at the university. And I kept hearing about this ecosystem that we were trying to build. Now, ecosystems are messy. They're a tangle. They're complex. And every time I got a slide of an ecosystem, it was a perfect circle, completely enclosed, with these little borders, balloons with whatever the heck our priorities are. And every time at the meeting when this slide came up, I said, it's not an ecosystem. Well, yeah, that's okay. It's like, no, it's not okay. If your narrative and symbolic communications are wrong, then you're not communicating effectively. You're not sharing knowledge effectively. And you're not respecting cultural differences, cultural diversity, and the complexity and beauty of explanatory frameworks. So if the artsy-fartsy scholar says, not an ecosystem, instead of going, oh, we're too busy doing science, decide, do we need a better visual representation of what we're doing? Or do we need a better metaphor? Because when you go out in the world to communicate to people and you've got it wrong, that's how you build skepticism and distrust and fear. And we've got way too much of that going on right now. How many people, I mean, I only have like 5 people in the room, but how many people have heard Miranda Fricker? Okay, so Miranda Fricker wrote this really key article called on epistemic injustice. Really strong ethical framework for doing research with people marginalized for various reasons. So Miranda Fricker talks about, said, epistemic injustice. And she defines epistemic injustice as both testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. So testimonial injustice is disbelief or distrust in a person's account of injustice. Serena Williams almost died because her doctors didn't believe her when she said, I'm dying. Something's very wrong with my body. I know what's wrong with my body. I think it's this, and I think I'm dying. And they just would not believe her. They did not believe the testimony of a Black woman. And we have hermeneutical injustice, the denial or erasure of a person's experiences of injustice. We have to prove over and over and over again that racism is so a thing, that colonialism is so a thing, that sexism is so a thing, and that it hurts. Why can't you just get over it? No, why should we? Why should we get over it? And when we are constantly fighting to be heard, to be listened to be believed, to be validated, when our experiences and our explanations of our experiences are poo-pooed away, I mean, it's just that's all we can get done in a day. So one of the things we try and do in gender and sexuality studies is give our students the tools to overcome these forms of epistemic injustice. So I want to give a few examples that have come recently in the news. So how many people read the article in Ms. Magazine on, and there's been many, but Ms. Magazine this month, their lead story is on the erasure of pain by women patients, and use the example of endometriosis. You know, and there's some really important research going on right now across the disciplines on pain. But it came from the grassroots activism of gender and sexual and anti-racism communities first. So let's make sure we're not erasing those voices by turning around and explaining pain to them. They've been screaming in pain at us forever. But luckily, researchers are challenging this by determining whether or not women with endometriosis are fuckable. And yes, I said fuckable because it was published. And it took 7 years of fighting to get that article retracted. And I read the article before it was retracted because I was curious, what is the methodology here? How do you rank hotness? And of course, they came up with a rigorous quantitative measurement of body measurements. So, you know, the Marilyn Monroe factor, BMI, because of course, women more than a size 6 can't possibly be hot enough, and height. So anyway, I apparently am not fuckable enough to this journal because I'm too short. My body measurements are all wrong. And thank God for science. This got published. And you can't make any excuses for it. You can't say, well, it was an interesting and thoughtful methodology. It was not. It was just abhorrent levels of sexism. But of course, we have other examples. We all know in the health sciences, we are dealing with crippling workplace discrimination. Not just around gender and sexuality, certainly around indigeneity and race, across Alberta, story after story after story. And we at the University of Calgary are not immune. But again, thank goodness for science, because they published a study slut-shaming vascular surgeons for wearing bikinis on their vacations. Again, it was published. Again, they tried to justify it until finally agreeing to retract it. And I bring this one up because the methodology was a couple of dudes were going to stalk women's social media feeds, trolling for photos of them on vacation with their families or without their families. They don't have to have families. And if they found a photo of them in a bikini, they put it down as unprofessional. Who came up with this criteria? So now we're trying to fight workplace discrimination, but we've got to put all of our energy in to explaining over and over and over again to the editors of this journal engaged in practices of epistemic injustice about how this should have never been published. What is wrong with you that you thought it was okay to publish this? And in fact, those researchers should be called up on the carpet to their dean to explain their practices of stalking women online. You'd never get away with that in gender and sexuality studies, not on a prayer. Because we don't put people's lives at risk. We're not worried whether or not our patients in agonizing pain are hot. And we're not worried as our healthcare system is breaking down over whether or not a surgeon dared to go to the beach. So what do we mean when we talk about academic rigor? we talk about reliability, validity, and transparency. And just so you know, I'm not just going to be slugging off on the health researchers all the time. It's time to criticize porn scholars. Because boy, do we deserve it. All right. So, oh shoot, can we get rid of this? Oh, it better. Oh yeah. Because it got retracted quickly because gender and sexuality studies scholars were on the job. Okay, it doesn't take us as long. It doesn't take 7 years of bickering amongst men to get to a point of saying this is just freaking wrong. All right, but there are problems with some of the arguments. Ooh, okay, so just for those of you who don't know, this guy, Carl Anderson, who is an advocate for adult-child sexual relationships, aka a hideous human being, is working on his PhD right now. And he published an article in the Journal of Qualitative Research, because there's more and more interest in qualitative research happening in health sciences, which is great on the one hand, but we're really struggling over in gender and sexuality studies with rigor. Like, you know, we are begging you to be more rigorous about it, because there is this weird bias which turns on. So the weirdness of the bias is that it then starts to turn on a justification of a kind of a lack of rigor. You know, I'll say to a student, you don't have enough interviews, and they'll say, well, my health researcher committee says I do. I'm like, you don't. Well, in qualitative research, you don't need, yes, you do. So this got published. All right, so he wrote an article. It was an autoethnographic analysis of himself masturbating to a genre of manga that focuses on boy love. Now, manga is a whole other kettle of wax. Okay, there's a whole field of study on manga and gender and sexuality in manga, and I am not an expert there. There is you. Autoethnography is essentially doing you and taking notes and turning yourself into a research subject. It can be done with rigor, but it often kind of isn't. So he wanted to understand why some people get off on this type of manga, but it isn't his particular child sexual abuse material cup of tea. So he got a bunch of this manga and a box of Kleenex and spent a month masturbating and taking notes. Freaking published. And as Aaron said, wow, did that get retracted that quickly? I was like, yeah, because porn scholars went bananas. We were like, no, this is not what we do. But there were three kinds of arguments that were going on. One, which I have a lot of problems with, is it lacked objectivity, which I just like, that's just the least of its problem. But it also preserves the biased norms of objectivity, as if objectivity is an unproblematic stance, or even a desirable stance, or even a possible stance. So we're like, no, that's not the problem. Then there was the lacks ethical accountability, which we agree, it lacked a lot. But that fed into sex panic. And there's a lot of sex panic in scholarship. The academy is rife with sex panic and porn panic. And what I mean by that is we combat anti-sex worker stigma, anti-trans stigma, anti-porn stigma that frames the sexual subject as not an epistemic agent. Because if they knew better, they wouldn't be doing these dirty, dirty things. And somehow or another, this question of lacking the ethical accountability, which again, it did, but it went on this weird anti-trans train. And I actually had a meeting, there was about half a dozen of porn scholars. We kind of met on Zoom. We met on Zoom to try and figure out, what is going on? How on earth did this article become a flashpoint for anti-trans discourse? And our answer is no clue, other than anti-trans are going to anti-trans any chance they get to anti-trans. And just sex panic. That's the only thing we could come up with. And of course, the reproducing of stigma against porn and against sex work and against consensual porn consumption. Let me be clear, child sexual abuse materials can never be consensual, even if they're just drawings. But it became this whole, this is the problem with porn research. Porn scholars are all child sexual abusers and also maybe trans. And it's like, okay, so no to the former, and yeah, actually, fair enough on the latter. So that was a huge problem. But then, the porn scholars and the trans scholars who somehow got dragged into this with a, like, why are we here? Oh, right, epistemic injustice. We've got to fight a battle that's not ours today. We're like, this just lacks rigor. There's like, you need researcher accountability. And there are standards for qualitative and interpretive methods, and the Journal of Qualitative Methods should know that. What concerns us is that it was retracted real quick. I'd like to say it's because of porn and sex work scholars, but it wasn't. It was because of porn panic. And I speak on this today as we begin yet another round of court challenges in Canada against unconstitutional anti-sex work legislation that is keeping sex workers unsafe. I say this today, the week where Alberta announced an anti-trafficking commission, only on sex, not on construction or the oil sands, no, just sex. Chaired by country and western singing star and Coots Blockade supporter Paul Brent. Not by a sex worker. Shift Calgary's not there. I hope Act Alberta's there. So we, again, epistemic injustice. We don't believe, we don't distrust, and we erase the experiences of people who actually might know something about this. And I got into it with a colleague because they pointed out quite rightly Brent is a pediatric nurse. They have expertise. I'm like, absolutely, they have expertise. Are there any sex workers on this commission? No. That's epistemic injustice. So much for my mic drop. I don't know why it's not going. There we go. Thank you. Okay. In gender and sexuality studies, we must always have a praxis. Praxis, quite simply, is theory plus action. We have to imagine how our theories, how our methodologies, how our data, how our conclusions will be enacted. Now, sometimes that can get a little overinflated. I always have to explain to my students, no one's actually reads our academic research, except other academics. Let's be honest. I've served on SHRC and I've served on other committees. I always love the social outcomes section of scholars going, this will be of great interest to, and I'm like, no. Like, nobody cares, right? Nobody's going to read it. Nobody's going to care. Like, you know, if you're lucky if you get 500 people and they're all from the same community. So accept that. But you have to imagine what happens if. What happens if someone takes my article on porn and the public health crisis, because there is no porn public health crisis, you know, and then uses it in an article to claim falsely that Dr. Rebecca Sullivan has discussed this public health crisis, neglecting to point out, you know, that she's critiquing the sex panic against porn. We have to imagine what would happen if we were translated, interpreted, or misinterpreted into the public eye. We have to imagine our most vulnerable subjects who know better than us. And that is a challenge to scholars, because we're smart, right? We got PhDs. So we know better. The fundamental premise in gender and sexuality studies, and this is taken from disability activism, nothing about us without us. So go ahead and have your pediatric nurse on the Sex Trafficking Commission, but have working sex workers on there as well. I'll point out that the most recent parliamentary commission, when they were doing their latest hearings on porn panic, they brought in anti-porn activists from the United States and refused to let any sex worker agencies speak until they mounted a social media campaign. And we're all like retweeting and shaming and writing our MPs. And they're like, fine, we'll let you come in on the last day. You know, and so we're exhausted just to get our voices heard. Oh, no. Sorry. There. All right. So I spoke a little bit about intersectionality and decolonialism. These are buzzwords that I get really frustrated with when I hear them, if I don't hear, how are you doing it? And I really appreciated the slide at the beginning, but even that isn't enough to say how. That's a that statement, not a how statement. So Kimberlé Crenshaw, who came up with the term intersectionality, I strongly recommend you read Crenshaw. and read Patricia Hill Collins and read Catherine Harnois on doing intersectionality. She refers to structural, political, and representational frameworks of intersectionality. So one thing you want to do is you want to ask yourself, what is my structural framework? What is my political framework? What is my representational framework? Am I doing this? Woo, it worked. And if you say we're doing decolonial research, I strongly recommend Linda Tui Weiss-Smith's Indigenous Research Agenda from 1999. Notice how old these references are. We've known this stuff for a long, long time. It's just white women finally cottoned on to it that's moving up the chain. And that in and of itself is an ownership on us. And Tui Weiss-Smith talks about how we want to move from the outer into the inner circle, from survival to recovery to development to self-determination. Now, sometimes our research is working out the outer edges, you know, and all of that is okay. This is what has to do with transparency. Just say what you're doing. You know, avoid the savior complex of saying, I'm doing it all. Just say, right now, all I can do is representational intersectionality. All I can do is like maybe get us further down away from survival into recovery. You know, because we're in a conversation. We're working collectively. We are in an allied collaboration. This has been enormously influential to all of my research. Honoring our intellectual ancestors, a feminist of color treaty for creating allied collaboration. As I said, and I will conclude on this, gender and sexuality studies scholars, it's a long, long, long time before the research can begin. We can't start until the team is in place. And I don't want this to sound like a calling out. It's a calling in, but I did a calling in on the presentation that we had in this seminar, where I asked about, well, who's on the team? And it wasn't nearly as interdisciplinary as it could be. And as I recall, something said, you know, hey, does anybody know anyone from the territories? And I was like, well, why have you started if you don't have anyone from the territories? You don't get to start and hope that the marginalized subjects will find you. And if that means spending a lot of time and a lot of money cold calling and visiting and paying your respects, well, that's what decolonial research is. It can take years before you gain the trust of your epistemic agents, your allies. And they don't owe you anything. This is also what I always tell my students. It's like, don't expect gratitude for your research. Your subjects are doing you the favor. So if you're saying, yeah, but we got to get going because of a grant deadline or this or that, it's like, the agenda is theirs. The timeline is theirs. We don't benefit from having research that needs to be corrected, needs to be retracted. So if it's not ready, it's not ready. And get out there and find the people that you need. And that's a practice of humility and reflexivity. Methodologically, I would encourage you all to kind of look at your, you got your quantitative, you got your qualitative, you got your interpretive. Do you have them all? And if you don't, do you need them all? That's fine. If you don't need all three, you don't need all three. But have you asked yourself the difficult questions? about if you need all three, why you're not doing all three, how you therefore need to lower the frame of your research and admit transparently, I'm not doing this. It's okay to say that, but it's not okay to pretend you are if you're not. A lot of times we have to deal with hierarchies and ancestors. I like to put those two together. There's so many hierarchies, not just hierarchies of rank, which of course exist, the hierarchies of the supervisor-student relationship, which of course exist, the hierarchies of tenured and clinical and adjunct, which of course exist. But there are huge hierarchies within disciplines. And gender and sexuality studies is like, right at the bottom. We're not a priority. There is no one from gender and sexuality studies has been invited to serve on the university's EDI strategy. Not one. There's 3 engineers. We have academic expertise that no one wants to hear about. That's a hierarchy that needs to end. So ask yourself in your interdisciplinary team, does anybody on that team make you uncomfortable? Is anybody on that interdisciplinary team asking you questions you can't answer? That's reflexivity. And we do need to acknowledge our ancestors, because the people who came before are as exhausted as we are today. And they got us somewhere. They weren't perfect. Yes, second wave feminism's got a lot to answer for. It needed to be way less racist. It needed to be way less turfy, trans-exclusionary radical feminism. It needed to be way less swerfy, sex worker excluding radical feminism. But as I'm telling my students this term, it's like, well, they got us abortion rights. Y'all lost them. So we need to think much more complexly. We need a real ecosystem. And we need to be able to imagine an ecosystem that is rhizomic, not tidy. Because justice is never clean and tidy. And that's it.